Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Creo Assembly Management Performance. My name is Nick Exposito, the Marketing Director here at TriStar, and I'm very pleased to introduce our presenter, Shawn Schreckengost, Business Development Manager here at TriStar. Just real quick before we get started, I just want to do some quick bookkeeping and mention that a complimentary recording of this webinar will be sent to everyone who registered, and it will also be available on our website and our YouTube channel at TriStar Digital Thread Solutions shortly after the presentation. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Shawn.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you everybody for joining today. As Nick has mentioned, this webinar is going to address the assembly management and performance within Creo. Really what we're talking about is what's called simplified representations that allows us to, manage what we're kind of bringing into session when we open an assembly. My name is Shawn Schreckengost. I'm a business development manager for TriStar. I have been with TriStar for almost 14 years now. Prior to that, I was with PTC Direct for 16 years. I have a 43-year background in mechanical engineering. 41 of those years, I've been using various CAD platforms. So I've been using CAD for quite some time, with 36 years of that focused on PTC products. And I've been using Creo Parametric for over 26 years. I live in Colorado, right in the middle of the state. A beautiful place to live. If you ever get out this way, look me up and we'll get together and have a beer maybe. So when we talk about assembly management and performance, really we're talking about the specialized capabilities that allow us to manage not just a component display, but the performance of our system. So, any customer that works with very large assemblies can benefit from the tools and techniques that we're going to share today. Of course, these tools help us to manage our assemblies more effectively, and that helps us to reduce the product costs, improve our time to market, and reduce the development costs of our products. The process improvement really is dealing with 3D assembly modeling, and the technology allows us to create what's called a simplified representation to help improve our assembly performance. Allows us to work efficiently using on-demand simplified representations. We can define rules to automate those simplified representations, and we can work efficiently in different zones of our assembly to help control the clipping and component display. We can also create assembly templates with predefined simplified reps that helps us to manage those assemblies even before we create them, right? Because we'll have those tools embedded in those templates. When we think about a large assembly is mostly considered that is sheer number of parts, components, and sub-assemblies in an assembly. So if you have an assembly that might be thousands of parts, that would be considered a large assembly. But also the complexity of those parts and components and sub-assemblies makes a large assembly as well. If we have parts that have thousands of features in them, and then we have maybe 100 of those parts, that would still be considered a large assembly, not because of the number of parts, but just because of the complexity of the assembly. When Creo opens an assembly, there's several levels of data that gets loaded into memory. The first thing that gets loaded is the graphic information of the assembly. That gives us the ability to see the assembly and the components and so on. The next thing that gets loaded is the geometric information. This is the ability to actually touch the surfaces or the edges or the geometry within the assembly, take measurements, things like that, assemble components and so on, anything that we need to reference. The final thing that gets loaded into memory is the parametric information, and that gives us the ability to change the parts, modify dimensions, and regenerate the assembly and so on. So when we create simplified representations, that helps us to improve not just the regeneration time, but also the retrieval and display times of our assemblies. we have the ability to control which components of an assembly are actually being brought into session. Now, sometimes we're limited on the memory on our machines, and if we open up very large assemblies, we may consume all of that memory, and Creo would not be able to open the assembly. So we can actually control what we're bringing in to memory. We can also temporarily remove anything that we don't want to see while we're working in the assembly. Typically a complicated part or a complicated subassembly, or things that are not even related to what we're working on in our daily session. So we can fine tune those assemblies, and we can do that on the fly as we're working, or we can actually save these simplified representations to retrieve the assembly again and continue working maybe the next day or the next week or so on. So there are several default simplified representation types that Creo uses. First of all, the master representation. That's the fully detailed assembly. That's the graphic information, the geometric information, and the parametric information. We also have an automatic simplified rep. This tells Creo to bring into session only the minimum information required for the assembly to regenerate. Of course, that's going to certainly need the graphic information, but then it will bring the geometric information only that's needed for regeneration, and no parametric information would be brought into session. Now, the thing with the automatic representation is as we work in the assembly, Creo will then pull in what it needs. If we're trying to assemble a component and we're selecting references, that's the time that it would bring in that geometric information. If we try to make changes to a model within the context of the assembly, that's when it will bring in the parametric information. So what you'll find is if you use the automatic representation, things will open fast, but then as we work in the assembly, you might find a little bit of a delay because it has to go and retrieve that information. Exclude is an option that tells Creo to remove those components from the session. And then if we choose afterwards, we can actually remove those components from memory. But then if we go to another simplified rep, such as the master rep or the automatic rep, then it would want to bring in those components again. But that's typically the tool that we would use to create a simplified rep. We might create a representation that is using the master representation, but then exclude components that we don't want to see. There's an option to create a default envelope. That's going to represent an assembly or assembly components with an envelope part. Of course, if we use this tool, that's going to require us to actually create a PRT that has to be then managed. But what we would use that for is to maybe create a shrink wrap that represents those subcomponents in the assembly. And then maybe if we want to share the assembly with a vendor or a customer, we can then save that assembly out without having all the detail that might be included in those components. And there's also the user defined. The user defined is just taking a subassembly that we might be using in the top level assembly, and there may already be a representation defined either in that assembly as an assembly simplified rep or in the parts as a part simplified rep. When we open an assembly, we typically use the open or double click. Those are the most common ways to open an assembly. Of course, that will always bring in the master representation because we're not telling it otherwise. We can use the drop-down menu, which allows us to open the dialog for opening the representations that might be available within that assembly that are already defined. We can also use Open Automatic, and that's a predefined simplified representation provided with the software. There's also the Open Subset. That allows us to open an assembly without bringing in the master into session until we choose what we want to see. And then that comes in the session as a modified master simplified rep, which we can save if we want to keep that for later use, or if we're just working on the assembly temporarily and we want to just bring in a few parts of the assembly in the session, we can do that as well. There are some config options that help us manage how we open the assemblies. One of them is to open simplified representation by default. Now that setting is set to no by default. But if we change that setting to yes, then it will force the dialog to open the list of available representations. So that's a really good config option to have turned on, because that prevents you from opening a very large assembly that you might not want to actually open, right? So you can, kind of pause a little bit. It's an extra click, but then it gives you that ability to either, kind of abort or pick the representation that you want to open. There also is a config option that if we create a rule-based simplified representation, to force Creo to evaluate those rules upon opening, and that's also a good one to turn on. And I'll show you these config options in the demonstration. So let's go ahead and get into the demonstration. And I have Creo 11 running today. I know a lot of customers are on 11 or 10 or maybe even 9 still. Creo 12 was just released earlier this year. However, I don't know a lot of customers that are on Creo 12 yet. So I'm going to use Creo 11 today because I think that's probably the most common version that people are on. I'm going to open up an assembly that is not super large, but it does have a couple thousand components in it, and so it takes a little bit of time to open. Now I just did an open, which tells it to open the master representation, so you can kind of get an idea of how long this assembly takes to come into session. It's not slow, but certainly if it was 10 times as large, it would take 10 times as long. So where we access our simplified representations is from our View Manager dialog. And here we have the tab to create simplified representations, or toggle from one representation to another. So as we create simplified representations, we'll see them show up in this list here. So I'm going to open the assembly again. I'm just going to get out of it real quick, right? And then we're going to use open again, and I'm going to use my drop down so that we can see the options that are available to us. Now, if we turn on that config option that forces this open representation dialog, we don't have to worry about accidentally opening the top level assembly by accident, right? So I'll show you that config option right now, but this is the open representation dialog, right? Now, again, if I were to just double click on the assembly, I would get the master rep, just because that's the default, right? So I'm going to go ahead and show you where this dialog is. We're going to go to the options here, and we're going to go to our configuration editor, and you'll see that we have this down near the O's here, open simplified representation by default. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to yes, which will force that dialog to open if I double click on my assembly. So we'll say open again, and I'll double click on that top level assembly. And you'll see now this dialog is forced to open. So we'll go ahead and open that assembly again. Okay, so this goes, the same amount of time, but we have that extra click. It's kind of a fail-safe to prevent us from, again, opening a very large assembly by accident. I'm going to close this one more time, and now I'm going to open the automatic rep. So you can just kind of see the difference in the time here. It's a little bit faster, maybe not too noticeable for this assembly, but again, if I was opening a very large assembly, I might see some improvements in the speed. So what we're seeing here now is the automatic rep, and it tells us here in the lower left-hand corner that is the representation that we have open. It did open a little bit faster than the master rep because it's only bringing in the graphic information and the geometric information that's needed for regeneration. So now if I were to start to maybe reassemble some things or move things around, then it would have to pull that extra information in the session at the time. So this is kind of a nice default representation to use if you're not creating your own simplified reps and you just want to be able to work a little bit faster. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to toggle now to the master rep, And you'll see that now it takes a little bit of time extra to bring in that additional information. All right, so we'll just let it do its thing here. And there it is. Okay, so now we're in the full fidelity of this assembly. There are several ways to create simplified representations. One of the most common ways to create simplified representations is to select on some particular components that we might want to have removed from the display. So we can select them from the tree, or we can actually select them from the graphic window. Now I'm going to go ahead after I've select these, and I'm going to change my representation to exclude. Now what that does is it actually modifies the master representation. So I would have to save that if I want to use it again. The master representation cannot be overridden. So when we go to our representation dialog, we'll see that, or I should say the view manager, we'll see that the master rep has been modified with that plus mark right there, and we can see it in the graphics window as well. So what we'll want to do then is we're going to save this. And Creo, again, will not let us save over the master representation, so it wants to provide us with a kind of a default naming convention, rep 0001, right? So I'm going to go ahead and change the name to that, and I'm going to call this no chassis, right? Because I've just pretty much pulled away all the body components of this truck example. So I'm going to just call this no underscore chassis, and we'll save that. So now we have that in our list, and we can toggle back to the master representation. That goes very fast because all of the master representation, or all of the components, are already in session, even though I have them removed from that no chassis simplified representation. Now, what I can do to help improve my performance or release some memory, I can go to File, Manage Session, and Erase Not Displayed. And these are all the components and subassemblies that are excluded in this simplified rep. So we can go ahead and say OK, and that removes that information from memory. Now, if I go back to my view manager and I go back to master rep, of course, then it has to bring that back into memory, right? So you have to consider that as you're working with these simplified representations, is when you take stuff out of memory and then you want to bring it back, it does have to load it again from the file system. Now what I'm going to do is talk about other ways to select components for creating a simplified representation. I can certainly activate the no chassis and then continue to add components to it. Maybe I want to select additional things here and say, set the representation to exclude. I could do that, and then that would be modified the chassis, right? And it shows as being modified. If I do not save it, it's going to ask me to say, hey, it's unsaved. Do you want to continue? And I'm going to say, okay, right? Now, had I saved it, of course, I wouldn't have seen that message. I can also select components using what's called this 3D box select down here in the lower right-hand corner next to my selection filter. If I use the 3D box select, it wants me to first select, and I'm going to go ahead and do that again. It wants me to first select some planar surface to help define this box. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select this back surface off of this part of the truck, and then it asks me to pick 2 points to draw the box. So I'm just going to very quickly draw a box here in that location. So what this gives me is a box that will select for me everything that's inside the box, right? So I can drag these arrows to make my box bigger in any of these 6 directions. Now what I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead to my front view, And I really want my box to be all the way out here, and I don't want anything on that side of it. That's pretty much high enough, and then I'll bring this down to right about there. And then I'm going to go to my right view and make sure that my side to side is, where I want it to be. So then we'll go back to the default orientation, and you can see what's being selected within this box, right? So if I wanted to, I can then right click and set the representation to exclude again. And those are the components that get excluded from this representation. Again, because I was in the master rep, it gets marked as modified. And if I want to save this, I can save it by going to my view manager, and I can right click and save this as, let's say, no underscore truck underscore bed for this one. Okay, and so now I have that additional simplified representation within my view manager. I can toggle to these at any time. And again, this goes pretty quick because I still have everything in session as I'm working here, but I'm just kind of setting up a couple of simplified representations. Another way I can create a simplified representation is I can use my find tool, right? So if I use my find tool and I look for anything that I want to search for, maybe I'm looking for a component in my assembly, and I'm going to look for it by its name. And I might say that I want to look for anything that has the name of hex bolt, right? And I'm using some wildcards here. And I can say find now, and these are all of the components that have that name. So I can then select those by adding them to my selection, right? And then I can set the representation for those. So we have several ways to manually select components that we might want to put in a simplified representation. Now, to be honest, if I really want to get rid of all my hex bolts for a simplified representation, this is probably not the way to do it, because by selecting them using the find tool or by manually selecting them from the tree or the graphics window, that is a one-time selection, right? So that would only affect the components that are selected at this time. So if I said set this representation to exclude, then those would be excluded. However, if I were to add more bolts that have that same name, they would still show up in the simplified representation. So probably not the way that I'd want to go about it. I'd probably be better off setting up some kind of a rule-based representation, right? So if I create rules for these things, I can then be assured that if these components are added again, or another subassembly that has these components in it, they would also automatically be removed from the simplified representation. So what I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and set a representation up that's going to be rule-based, that allows me to manage that a little bit better. And then if something changes, it's going to update automatically for me. So that's how we're going to set this up. And I'm just going to kind of collapse everything in my tree here real quick. Not that it matters, but so to do a simplified representation that's rule-based, we're going to go ahead and create one from within the dialog, right? So I'll say, give me a new representation, and I'm going to call this one no underscore hardware. Okay, and then by doing that, I am presented with this dialog that allows me to create, a little bit, more within the simplified representation, a little, more things going on. I can certainly select from this list and change the way it's displayed. But what I want to do first is I want to set up the default rule for this no hardware simplified representation. And so my default rule is I want everything to be seen as the master rep. So when I do that now, everything is shown as the master rep, but that's derived from the default rule. And then I can change these individually if I like. I can change them from here and say, well, I really want to exclude that one, right? So I can certainly do it from this list. But what I want to do here is I want to create a rule. And so I'm going to edit the rules, and I get this, rule kind of actions dialog to create these rules. And I'm going to create a new rule that's going to be an action of excluding. So even though my default rule is master, now I'm going to exclude from this representation. And I don't have any conditions yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new condition. I'm just going to right click and I'm going to say new, and then I'm going to give it a name. And maybe I'll call this condition hardware. Okay, and we'll accept that. And then I get a rule editor that actually looks a lot like my find tool. So I'm going to create a rule that says look for a solid model by a name, and I'm going to type in that name, hex bolt. Now that's there already because I had already typed it in my find tool, right? Whoops. And then we'll just preview that, and we can see that those are all the components that would be removed in this simplified representation. So I'll say OK here, and we're going to say, I just want to make sure I got my rule defined correctly here. So we're going to do that. Edit the redefine, and here you see that rule, right? So that rule is looking for anything with the name hex bolt in it to be removed from this simplified rep. So we're going to say OK here, and we're going to say OK, and then I'm going to open this simplified rep. Now, you probably didn't see much happening here, but there was actually, if we look underneath the truck here, there was actually a bolt in these holes, and that's what got removed. So I'm going to go back to the master rep just so you can see that that bolt comes back into session. So we'll go back to the hardware, and I also want to remove the nuts and the washers, right? So I'll go back into my simplified rep of no hardware. I'll edit the definition of that. I'll go to my rules, and I'm going to edit the rules, and I'm going to use my hardware here, and we're going to redefine it. Now, what we're going to do with this is we're going to add some rules to the list. So what I'm going to type in here is I'm going to look for a name, anything that has the name hex nut in it, and then we're going to add that rule to the list. Now we do have an operator here, or and. Of course, I don't want a name that has hex bolt and hex nut in it. I want and the hex bolt or the hex nut. And then I'm going to add one more here, and this will be the washer, and I'm just going to type in the word washer. Okay, and then we're going to say okay with that after we add the rule and say okay. We'll accept that, and then we're going to open that rep, and here you'll see that that other hardware has been removed. If we go back to the master rep, they come back. Now, it's very typical that we want to remove hardware from our assemblies, because if we're working on a very large assembly that has a lot of hardware, we really probably don't need to see that. So it makes it easy to pull in, the components that we want to work with without having all that extra, parts being brought into session. Now, I also have some more hardware in these lugs here, right? So if I look at this component, it's got a name of CM225. I mean, I don't really want to use that necessarily as a name, although I could, like I just did in those other 3 rules. But probably what would be better off for me is to use an attribute. So if I open up one of those bolts and I look at the tools and parameters, I'll see that there are maybe some attributes that I can use in this rule, right? So maybe by description, I'm going to use the word lug as my rule. So I'll go ahead and do that. I'll go back to the assembly, and I'll go back to my view manager where I'm going to activate my no hardware. I'm going to edit its definition. I'm going to go to my model rules and edit the rules. And I could add that rule to the condition, right? Or I can actually create another rule here that's based on attributes, right? So what I'll do here is I'm going to say, go ahead and give me a new one that's exclude. And I'll create a new condition and I'll call it lugs. And enter. And then here, I'm going to look by expression. When I do this, just like my parameters, I have different types of parameters. I'm going to look for the string parameters. Now, what this will do is give me all of the string parameters that are available in every single part in my assembly. So this list could be fairly extensive, right? And so then I'll use the symbol or the expression, and you can see that this is it's a pretty good sized list. And again, it's because it's giving me every string parameter from every part within the assembly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use that description right there, and then is equal to, and I'm going to use my wildcard again and use the word lug. So any description that has the word lug in it will be created or selected as that rule. So we'll add that rule to the list, and then we're going to say okay, okay again, and then we'll open it, and you'll see that those lugs have been removed. So what's nice about having the rule-based simplified representation is if I add another component that has those lugs in it, they would automatically be removed from this simplified rep. So if I pick on that tire here, I can see that it's this assembly right here, the 30112. So what I'll do here is I'm going to assemble, and I'll search for that component, 3012. I think that's the one I want, and we'll use the master rep, and we'll say okay, and we're going to use the generic of this, and I'm going to just put that in place somewhere. Maybe we'll kind of drag it over here. I'm just going to kind of fix it in place, something like that, maybe drag it up a little bit, and then we'll say okay. I'm going to fix it in place, and then we'll say okay. Now what you'll see is that those lugs have been removed from that simplified representation automatically. I didn't have to pick them, right? If I go back to the master rep, of course, those lugs come in and show up in place. Okay, so very, very nice way to create kind of an automated simplified representation. Okay, another thing that we can do is we can create a zone that we can use to manipulate or automate our simplified representations. So a zone is actually created in the cross-section drop-down, and you'll see zone here down at the bottom, right? So I'm going to create a brand new zone, and with the zones, the first option is to use what's called half space, or basically selecting one side or the other of a plane. Right, so I'm going to use this plane right here in my model, and I'm going to say that I want to use that side of that plane. And then I can add additional planes, and I'm going to use that plane there as well. So now I have the front side of one plane and the front side of the other plane. So that kind of represents that zone. I can continue selecting planes to create the zone if I want to, maybe even make it more elaborate. But I think this kind of proves our point here is that, we can create these zones very quickly. Now, before I accept this, I'm going to show you that we do have other options for creating zones. The second option is to be inside or outside of a quilt. Now, a lot of times when we're working in assemblies, especially very large assemblies of, say, maybe an airplane or a spacecraft, something like that, typically those assemblies may have some space claims already created at the top level that would be created with surface extrudes or revolves or things like that. So that would be considered a quilt. That's a closed quilt. And we could use that as our zone. We can also use a radial distance from something such as a curve, an edge, a vertice, a datum point. Now, these uh, radial distances are good for, maybe I have a cable route through my assembly, and I want to make sure that if there's anything in the area of the cable, that it's included in my simplified representation, right? So if I do that radial distance from a cable, or the center line, I should say, then I can, create my simplified rep using that. And then I also have the ability to kind of create a box with a offset from a coordinate system. So those are my options. Most commonly you are going to be using either this half space or a radial distance from. Those are kind of the easiest ones to set up. But I'm just going to use my half space for this one. I've already defined my zone using those two surfaces, and I'll say okay, right? Now this does go into my footer where my cross sections would typically be, and there you can see that zone, right? So if I pick on it, you can kind of see what's going on there. And then I'm going to go ahead and just change the name of that zone, and I'll call it zone underscore 01. Okay, I could give it something more explicit, of course. I can name it anything I want, right? And then I'll go ahead and I'm going to create another new simplified representation. And I'll just go ahead and call it zone underscore 1. And then I'm going to make my default rule be master rep again. And then I'm going to edit the rules to add a new rule of exclude. And I'm going to create a new condition, and I'll call this zone underscore 01. This lets me get away with using the same name. It's very rare in Creo that you can use the same name for multiple things, but in this case, it lets me do it. Now for this, I'm going to say I want to create a selection by geometry. And then here, the default for this rule is using a zone. And I'm going to say inside the zone, which would be excluding, right? Because that was my condition. And I'm going to use the zone that's available, zone 1, right? And I'm going to add that as my rule. And so now everything that is within the zone and crossing the zone gets selected. So it's a little bit different than this 3D box select, where 3D box select is only what's inside the box. But with the zones, it's really what we want is the things that are crossing into the zone also. Because if you could imagine, if I had created a zone of a cable route that's a radial distance from that, then I want things that are coming, within that radial distance, not just completely inside of it, but actually kind of crossing over it, if you understand that, right? So very important to understand the difference between the two. So, but that's what I'm going to use, right? I'm going to accept that, and then we'll go ahead and open that simplified representation. And again, you can see that even though my zone was of those two surfaces, there are some components that were crossing in that zone that are automatically getting removed from this simplified representation. Now, if we were to move something into the zone, of course, it would get removed automatically, right? So if I close this, and I'm in that zone simplified representation, if I were to move this wheel kind of up into that zone, it would be removed automatically. So what we'll do is we'll take that wheel, I think it's the last one in here, we'll edit its definition, and I'm going to remove this fixed constraint, and I'm going to just kind of move it into the zone. So we'll use our views here to help with that. I'm going to move it up. I'm going to move it over. We're going to go to the right side, and then we'll move it over into the center. Okay, so by doing that, what you'll see is I'll just regenerate. and that gets removed because that's, again, part of that zone. Now let's go back to our view manager here, and we'll go back to the master rep so that we can see everything again. So hey, I'm carrying an extra spare within my assembly. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this assembly, and let's talk about, now how do we open the assembly, and what are our choices here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this. I'm going to put this back in the default. Just kind of a little pet peeve of mine. I like to always put my assemblies back to their default location before, or default orientation before I save them, and then we'll get out of here and we'll erase this from memory. So now what I have is I'm going to go ahead and open that assembly again. And because I turned on that config option that says force the open rep dialog by default, even if I double click on that, that's what I get. Okay, and so you'll notice here that I also have the evaluate rules turned on. Now I have a config option that does that for me. I'll show you that before we go into the assembly. I'm going to go to my options, and this one is auto evaluate rules. So you'll see that right there at the top. Again, that default is set to no, so you'll want to turn that on. And what that does for me is make sure that all of my rules get evaluated as I open the assembly. Now, the reason for that is because somebody might have been working on one of the sub-assemblies and have added components that might be affected by those rules. So we certainly want to evaluate that upon opening. So I'm going to go ahead and open that again, and we'll double click on it, and then I can pick which simplified rep from this list that I want to open. So maybe I want that no chassis. I'll double click on that, and then that's the representation that I get. So of course this comes in the session a lot faster, and it may be all I need to do the work that I'm working on. Maybe I'm working on the drivetrain somewhere, and I don't really need to see all that heavy chassis surfacing type components and stuff. So I can very easily see what I need to get my job done. Okay, so I can then toggle to the different reps. Once I'm in here, I can certainly go back to my zone rep if that's what I want to do. Or, of course, now that zone is bringing in some things that were not in session, but it's also removing some of the things that I had just been working with, right? And then if we go to master rep, even still, it's got to bring in those components into session. Okay, so these are tools that are, take a little bit of practice, especially when you're setting up the rules to make sure you get them set up correctly. But once you've done that, then you can easily, navigate into your assemblies. And if they're very large, you can open up the areas that you want to work in so that you're not, bogging down your system and having to regenerate everything when you make a change. Okay, now one of the things that I like to do is, and I help my customers a lot in setting up their Creo infrastructure, in particular their templates, their start parts and start assemblies. You can actually set this up in advance so that you can have simplified reps already defined in your assembly using rules, right? So what I'll do here is I'm going to go ahead and open a new assembly, and I'm going to call this, I'll just say it's rule-based example. And I'm using my assembly template. That doesn't have any rules in it, but I do have one that does. So I'm going to uncheck that template box, and I'm going to open a new assembly. And I'm going to use this one here that I've named it with simp rep, right? So that's my template that already has predefined simplified reps by default. This is my default assembly because I don't always want those same rules, but in this case I do. So I'll go ahead and open that representation or that assembly. So even in a brand new assembly, I have some simplified representations already defined. So we have one that's called no hardware. Now that's a rule-based simplified representation. And then I have a structure only, which is basically just a default rule. So if we look at that, I'll say edit the definition, and you can see that my default rule is to exclude. So if I were to add something to this assembly, they would be excluded as well. Now, why would I want to do something like that? Well, sometimes I want to go into an assembly and I just want to work with the assembly structure, right? I might want to delete some things or just, manipulate the structure or move some components around within the tree. And therefore, I don't need to see any of that geometry, right? I also have the no hardware. Now, this is using a rule. If we go to the rules, and we'll see that the rule is using a condition called exclude hardware. But if I redefine this, this is actually using an attribute or expression, which is a string, sort category, and hardware. Well, what does that mean? Well, I have in my parts, I have a parameter called sort category. Now, again, like I said, I work with my customers a lot to help them set up their infrastructure. So if we look at a brand new part now, I'll go get out of here. I'll just create a brand new part, and I'll call it, hardware underscore rule underscore example. Okay, and in my start part, I have some parameters, right? And one of those parameters, as I just explained, is this parameter that I like to call sort category. If you don't have something like this in your start parts, it's something to consider, because what I've done here is I've made a restricted value parameter that is basically a drop-down list. And in this list, I have different, categories of parts or subassemblies and so on. So I might create something that's called hardware, right? And I'll say, okay, so I've given it that parameter value, and then let's just go ahead and create something on here real quick. I'll extrude, a circle here. We'll just make a quick part out of this, right? With a couple circles here, and we'll change that to a diameter of 5. We'll say that's 4, something like that, and we'll extrude that at a depth of 20. All right. So that's this hardware rule example part. And again, I've set that parameter from my start part to represent hardware. So if I go into my assembly that I just created, and we'll see that we're in the master rep, I'll go ahead and assemble that hardware in session, right? So it was what I call hardware, in session. There it is right there. And I'll put that at the default constraint. All right. Now, this is a very simple assembly. It's only got one part, but just to prove the point that by setting this stuff up in advance, I can then go to my no hardware representation. And because that part had that attribute, that gets removed. Also, if I go to structure only, because the structure only has the default rule of exclude, that wouldn't be there. But then I go back to the master rep, and there we have it. All right. Now, what I'm going to do here also is I'm going to assemble, and I'm going to assemble that top level assembly, right? So we'll go ahead and do that, and I'll just use the master rep, and we'll put that at the default location, and we'll say OK. And now, because I'm using this subassembly in my new rule-based example top assembly, if I go to my structure only, you can see that I have the full access to the structure of this assembly. However, I'm not seeing anything in session. And I can certainly come in here and manage my session and erase not displayed. And that gives me some more of my memory back, right? So again, very, very easy tools to work with once you kind of feel them out a little bit and get how to create the rules and what are the different ways to select. But you'll find that by creating some simplified reps in your large assemblies, You'll certainly improve the performance of Creo, isolate areas of the assembly that you want to work on. I mean, there's no reason that we need to work in the top assembly for everything that we do. We can work in these subsets of the assemblies if we need to. Okay, now the last thing I want to show you is that we do have the ability upon opening up an assembly is to open up the subset of that assembly. And then what this lets me do is pick and choose what I might want to see within this assembly, right? So I might want to say, well, I want to see that one, and I want to see that one, and I want to see that one. And then I'll say open, right? Now, whoops, I think I had everything in session. So let me get out of this real quick. We'll do this one more time. We're going to say open that assembly using a subset. Yeah, that's a little bit more like it. Now, in this case, it's kind of giving me a lightweight representation of the components. So it's not really bringing all that parametric information into session. But maybe I want to pick from here and I want to say, well, I do want to see that when I open the assembly, right? So we're going to set that to retrieve. And then I think there were some other things that we had. Part of that, we'll set that to retrieve. And this one will say retrieve. All right. So again, now I'm just pulling in the chassis, right? Where I made that one simplified rep that had no chassis. This one's going to be just the chassis. And then we'll open it. Now, this is creating a modified master representation on the fly. So this is a kind of a quick way to get into an assembly that might not have simplified representations, and you want to create one for this. Or maybe I don't want to create one, I just want to work with these components. But in this case, I'm going to go ahead and save that. I'll say save that master rep, and I'll call this chassis only, right? Right? And then we'll say OK. Right? So now I have that as another simplified rep to work with. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my master rep real quick. Well, not real quick. I still got to bring in that data into memory. And then I'm going to go ahead and save it. Right? So I'll have access to that next time, and then we'll close all this. Okay? So with that, I've pretty much shown you everything that you might want to know about a simplified representation. And I can open up the session for questions. And Nick, if you'll field the questions for me, please.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll start here with Marvin. Marvin asks, will simplified rep type, quote, automatic correctly display assembly features and flexible components?
So that's a good question. Previous versions of Creo, you would see errors in your tree, and they fixed it in, I think it was Creo 10 or 11. I'm in 11 now. So in previous versions, you would have seen some warnings and failures within the tree, but I'm finding that in Creo 11, I'm not having those issues. But good question.
We got next question here is from John. He says, can you show the amount of memory used when you have each rep open?
I don't know of a way to do that. I'm not sure if there is, but I don't know of the way to do that. I could probably go to my task manager and see how much memory is consumed, but I also have other applications. So I would have to look into that. Sorry, I don't have an immediate answer for you.
Brendan asks, can simplified reps or something similar be used in a way to, quote, configurations in SolidWorks, or is this exclusively for performance improvement?
This is really for performance improvements. There are some ways to kind of emulate a SolidWorks configuration, but in Creo, SolidWorks configuration is really considered a family table, right? Where you have different size bolts and things like that. But we can create kind of somewhat configurations within Creo by creating what's called a part simplified rep, right? So if I have a very complex part, I can actually exclude features from the part. That would be called a part simplified rep. That does not speed up regeneration because for a part simplified rep, Creo has to regenerate the part first and then regenerate the representation. So it doesn't speed up performance, but it does enhance your display because you're not seeing all the detail of those parts. Okay, so if I were to, let's go ahead and open up a part, and I'll show you that if I open up that part, I can create a part simplified rep, and maybe I want to get rid of some of this details of the tread here. So I'll find that. Whoop, that's the mirror. Where's the other side of this? Down here. So that's a copy geometry. So maybe I want to create a new simplified rep, and I'll just use the default name, but I'm going to go to features and exclude, and I'm going to exclude that pattern if I can find it in here. I think it might have been these copy geometries. I didn't catch the pattern on that, but let's go ahead and, yeah, there's that one there, and I'll go ahead and shift to that one, and then we'll say okay and done, right? So that should have, removed some of the treads. And here we can see we got some missing in here. So that's what got missed in that. And now we have that simplified rep. We'll go back to the master rep, and you see that piece of tread comes back, and there's the rep with it removed. So you can remove features or geometry from the session. Good question.
All right, we got a couple more questions here. Joe asks, how are relations affected by sim reps?
Well, you can write relations that leverage simplified representations, but the components that are affected by relations would need to be in session for those relations to regenerate, but it doesn't cause the relations to fail by using simplified reps, if that's what you're asking.
We got another here from Gordon. Gordon asked, I noticed you opened the master before saving. Can we save changes to assemblies in a simplified rep without opening the master?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay, great. We got a couple more here. Anthony asked, can we make reps in the assemblies? But when we can make reps in the assemblies, but when we get to the assembly drawing with different sheets and different reps, this seems to fall down.
So in the drawing, and this is typical of a sheet metal part. The sheet metal tools in the newer versions of Creo actually allow you to create a simplified rep for the flat pattern, right? Because in a sheet metal drawing, we typically want to show the bent up state as well as the flat pattern, and so we can set the rep for an individual view. So, let's go ahead and use this tire here as our example. I'll say master rep for now. I'm going to say, go ahead and give me a drawing for this. And I'll go ahead and say it's empty. I don't need to have a format, right? We're just going to show what's going on here. And I'm going to use the master rep, and I'll create the general view here. And we'll say its display is no hidden. All right. So here we have those treads on the top here that we wanted to see. I'll create another general view here, and we'll do the same thing, view display and no hidden, and say okay. But now what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click on this, and I'm going to say replace the view model, right? And here I'm going to open that rep that has those treads missing, and then we'll say okay. And there you can see in this view the treads are gone, but in this view the treads are there, right? So I haven't had a problem where this breaks. I'm not saying that the users might not be experiencing something different, but it would be a situation where it might be a unique case, and for me to troubleshoot something like that for you, I'd have to kind of look over your shoulder or see your parts and your configuration. But yeah, we can use those reps in the views in our drawings.
Shawn, do you have time for a couple more questions?
Yeah, I do have a few more minutes.
Okay, great. Let's see here. Joshua asked, can opening a simplified rep as default be set for an individual assembly rather than set as a config option for every assembly?
Can you repeat that, please?
Yeah. Can opening a simplified rep as default be set for an individual assembly rather than set as a config option for every assembly?
Well, once you set that config, it's going to affect every assembly because that's what the config does. Now, what I do sometimes is maybe I want to launch Creo differently, so I might create an icon that uses a different config file, right? That sets it differently. So you can set it up like that. I work with a lot of different customers, and many times I'm using their configs, so I have to create a launch of my icon for Creo to use their configs, right? So if I'm working with a customer, maybe I have a new customer. I'll say File Explorer here, and whatever. This is a new customer. I will go to my customers, and I'll say, give me a new folder here, right? And I'll say, I'll just say use new folder. And what I'll do here is I'll copy my modified config, but I'll also take my icon, copy and paste it into this folder, and then I'll edit the properties to pull the config from wherever I want to pull it from, right? So I might even want to pull it from this folder, Control C, and then I'll add that to my properties. Whoops, I don't want to do that. Dang it. Properties. And I'm going to say that's where I'm launching Creo, right? So we'll say, okay, I don't want this. And then what I'll do is I'll copy my config and edit it here so that when it launches, it's going to pull the config from right here. Okay, so you can do that, but once you set the config, it's kind of a global thing, right? So now what I'll do is I'll go into where my configs are, and I'll say users, public, documents, Creo configs, and then I'll just copy my config file to there, and then I'll edit that in my notepad. And even though I have the open by default here, if I can find it, this is open SIP rep by default. Let's find that right here. Let's see, where is that? There it is. So I might set it to yes for this config file, right? So now when I launch Creo with that config setting, that's what's going to happen. So that's a kind of a way to do that if you want to do that. But again, it is a one-time setting. Once you set it, every time you run Creo, it's going to be that way, unless you set up something like this.
All right, we'll take one more question from Joe. Do unused parameters affect regen time? Something around 50,000 as an example.
When you say unused parameters, do you mean parameters that have not been filled out by the user, or um, I,
Yeah, they did not specify there.
yeah? So
Uh,
a blank parameter is no bigger than
he's,
a
he
completed
clarified
parameter.
old wind chill parameter, like old wind chill parameters.
I have not seen any issues with that. Now, there is a way to get rid of old wind chill parameters, and I think I have that in my config file. I would just have to look for it. But there is a setting that allows you to delete those old parameters. Let me see if I can't find it. Um, I think it's this one. Nope. Um, I'll show it to you if I can find it here. Let me just look in here. I don't have a too extensive of a um, yeah, this one right here. DM emulate iLink system parameters. Set that to yes, and you would be able to delete those old legacy wind chill parameters.
Okay, great. All right, well, that is all the time we have today, everybody. We went a little bit over, but hopefully, next time tune in and we'll get to your questions then. We got another webinar coming up September 18th on MBD, so we hope to see you guys there. Shawn, thank you very much for your time, and thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, everybody.